So welcome to this session, which is a little bit different than anticipated because Richard Baldwin, who was to start us out, unfortunately has fallen ill and could not make the trip to Paris. But it does have actually one small advantage, which is that a very, very cramped session can now be a little bit less cramped. And the reason why this session on ITCEI is cramped is because we have 4 excellent speakers, papers, and a lot of ambition with this whole project. So let me explain what it is about. We created, so one of the things, and you heard this probably on the panel on Europe on Saturday, if you were there, there are so many new topics that are confronting Europe that fall outside the typical and traditional realm of what we have been thinking of. So it's no longer just about the Eurozone falling apart or not, or how to make the banking area more robust, and not even it is only about inflation or deflation, but we are talking about security, we're talking about defense, we are talking all of a sudden about a whole spectrum of economically highly important issues that decision makers and policy makers have to confront, and we all somehow have to help them analyze. And in many cases, we don't have good answers because the papers have not been written that are trying to address the answers. Competition with the US all of a sudden for subsidies, climate, how to deal with it in different ways. Well, I'll stop here just to say that so between Jean Pisani-Ferry, Jeromin, and myself, we decided to try something new. We do not start a new research policy group, but we launch a project, which is this ITCEI, Important Topics of Common European Interests. That is what it stands for. We decided together with a panel of advisors on the topic and decided on economic sovereignty. What does it mean? What does it not mean? What are the consequences in its different shades, from nationalism to trade policies and import substitution, etc. So we commissioned 4 papers, which are the papers that will be presented today, and the object, the goal in the end is to use these papers in order to draw policy conclusions. So with this, I have set it up to say that we will have these 4 papers presented. Isabelle, Mejean, Morgan Kelly, Moritz, Schularick, and Chad Bown will, I think in this order, present their paper, and then Jeromin is going to tell us what we learned from all of this. So please, Isabelle, the floor is yours. And, oh, sorry, before you say it, yes, maybe I should say it now. So I like to remind the audience of 2 things. Bus transfers from Boulevard Saint-Germain, so you have to walk over to Boulevard Saint-Germain, will be available after the last session to transfer to Bercy. And the buses depart at 7:15 sharp. And I also want to remind the audience to vote for the 3 your top 3 choices in terms of PhD posters. This was a competitive selection, and they are being every day there are new posters being exposed. But you can look at all of them on your app. If you download the program, the app of the program, then you can look at all of them, and please, with the QR codes which are available close to the posters or on the entrance, do give these young economists your vote. So thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks for having me. So what I'm going to present is joint work with Pierre Rousseau, who's actually in the room, doing his PhD at Crest in École Polytechnique. And what we want to do in this paper is to contribute to these debates that we've been developing over the last few years that are related to risk associated with global trade dependencies. So this is a topic that has been extensively discussed recently, but which to some way contrasts with the standard view that we usually have in international economics, which is that opening up to international trade should in principle offer some form of diversification against country-specific shocks. So from that point of view, international trade is a source of risk sharing. So that's what we teach our students in international economics, but in the meantime, what we know as well is that opening up to international trade induces specialization, and this specialization, especially within the so-called global value chains, has induced a very strong degree of concentration of trade among a small number of countries and firms within those countries. So this concentration of trade is very good in terms of efficiency, but also means that firms and countries end up exposed to very local supply shocks, which can induce some form of risk, new risk, such as vulnerabilities to supply chain disruptions, or the possibility of shortages on some goods that are essential for the economy to run. And more recently, we've also discussed the possibility that international trade can be weaponized. So these are things that we've been extensively discussing over the last few years, and what we've seen as well is that there might be some argument in favor of public interventions towards more resilience in international trade, because some of the economic mechanism and the organization of production within those global value chains may induce a form of underinvestment in resilience that could in itself eventually justify public interventions. So what we argue here is that there is a trade-off between the efficiency gains and also the risk-sharing properties of international trade, and eventually the increased resilience that we might want to achieve through those public interventions. And given this trade-off, it's very important that public interventions in favor of more resilience are well targeted. So in order to achieve this targeting, the first thing that we are going to propose is that we need to have a very clear diagnosis of trade vulnerability. So where is it that international trade is exposing us to too much risk? And that's the first part of the paper. And then we are going to argue that these trade vulnerabilities need to be discussed in light of the type of risk that they expose economies to. And so once you have this kind of diagnosis together with clear objective in terms of risks that public interventions might want to insure against, we can think about the type of policy tools that could be used in order to achieve more resilience in trade. And again, keeping in mind that any resilience gain that we can achieve through those policies need to be compared with more traditional gains from trade in terms of efficiency and again, risk sharing. So as I said, the first step is going to be on this diagnosis, and here we are going to start from some strategies that have been developed over the last few years, which are basically meant to use disaggregated trade data to try identify fragilities in trade networks that might expose countries to too much risk. So in particular, what we're starting from is the European Commission's bottom-up approach, which is basically a very detailed analysis of the structure of international trade that is meant to identify, again, this list of products that are potentially vulnerable to trade disruptions. So what we do is to reproduce what they did. So basically, this bottom-up approach is based on 3 criteria that, again, are recovered from disaggregated trade data. So we use product-level trade data for the consolidated EU 27. We pull data over 2015 to 2019. And then we apply the criteria that the European Commission has proposed to identify those vulnerabilities. Those criteria are based on the structure of trade. So one criterion for vulnerability is that international trade is very much concentrated across a small number of countries. And here the idea is basically that with too much concentration, you're going to lose the benefit of trade in terms of diversification of risk, and you're going to end up too much exposed to country-specific shocks. And this is the first criterion, and the next two are meant to take into account the fact that you might be very much exposed to international trade on a particular product, without this being a problem if you have production capacities within the European Union. So what they do is to use the structure of intra-EU trade flows in order to get an estimate of the amount of production capabilities that might be used in case of a disruption in international trade. So we reproduce those three criteria, and then we complement their analysis with an additional two criteria. One is based on actual data on production capabilities within the European Union. So what we do is to complement the trade data with the ProdCom data, which can be used to identify at the product level the level of production within the European Union. And finally, the fifth criterion that we added is meant to capture the possibility that in case of a disruption in international trade, firms and countries might substitute away from those countries through substitution towards other possible partners. And of course, this possibility of ex-post substitution varies very much across product markets. In some product markets, it's very easy to switch from one supplier to the other. But we also know that a number of product markets are organized in a way that involves a lot of relationship-specific investment. And if it is the case that input-output relationship in a particular market involve a lot of relationship-specific investment, then we should not expect too much substitution away from the disrupted trade flows in case of a disruption. So in order to come up with this, we use a measure of stickiness that has been developed in a paper by Martin et al., and that measures at the fine level the degree of relationship-specific investment, and we consider that trade vulnerabilities in product markets that involve more relationship-specific investment are more of a problem. So when we combine those different criterion, this is what we obtain. So we start from the whole list of products that are characterize international trade. So in standard product nomenclature, there are about 5,000 different products. And then when you first apply the filtering that has been proposed by the European Union, you come up with about 300 different products that are considered potential trade vulnerabilities by the European Commission. This corresponds to about 8.5% of the overall imports of the European Union. And then when we apply the additional two criteria that I just described, we further filter the list of those products to only 49 different products that represent about 0.5% of aggregate imports that we argue should be scrutinized into more details, because those product markets not only display very concentrated international trade, but they also concern products for which there are little production capacities within the European Union. And on top of this, these are product markets in which relationship-specific investment are important, and thus substitution away from current input suppliers in case of a disruption are likely to be particularly difficult. So in the paper, obviously, we give more details about the list of those trade vulnerabilities, but that's the first step in our analysis. The second thing, as I said, is that not only do we want to identify a list of potential trade vulnerabilities, but we also want to think about the type of risks that any public interventions might want to insure consumers against. And that's very important because different types of vulnerabilities do not expose the economy to the same type of risk. So over the last few years, a lot of arguments have been made for investing into more resilience. So I'm going to give a list of those arguments. The first one is related to what I mentioned before, the fact that with globalization, we've seen a lot of, a strong degree of concentration in the production processes at the global level. And this concentration of global value chains can expose firms and countries to localized supply shocks that are going to propagate along the network. And so this induces some enhanced risk. And on top of this, because of this network structure of international trade, there is a risk of an underinvestment into resilience, because basically firms can invest into improving the resilience of their production process, and this is going to benefit the whole network. And because of that, there might be some underinvestment. So in order to capture this idea that disruptions might be particularly important in global value chains, what we did is to cross our list of trade vulnerabilities or potential trade vulnerabilities with a measure of the position of the product into value chains using the upstreamness measure that has been proposed by INSEAD et al. And basically what we argue is that vulnerabilities that come up at the top of global value chains, so upstream in those value chains, are probably more of a concern because shocks involving firms in those particular stages are likely to propagate then along the whole network. So when we do this, we see that a lot of the vulnerabilities that we've identified are actually trade dependencies over final consumption goods, while instead there's a small number of product markets that are identified as trade vulnerabilities for Europe that are very upstream and thus are likely to induce a lot of propagation in case of a disruption. So in particular, you see a lot of those products in the chemical industry, in the mining, basic metals industry, etc. The second argument that we want to emphasize is the fact that this view of global value chains that we develop in this paper is static, is based on the current structure of global value chains, but what we know as well is that the European industry is going to evolve quite a lot in the next decade, and so the competitiveness of the European industry also needs to be thought about with a more prospective view. And so in particular, we know that in the future decarbonized economy, there will be a number of new green technologies that are going to be very important for the competitiveness of Europe. And securing input sourcing in those industries might be particularly important. So in the paper, what we do is to go through a number of those technologies, and we look at the structure of trade in these industries, so that to try think about the future dependencies that the European industry might have to face. So I don't have much time to detail, but basically what we do is to look at the structure of trade in the context of lithium-ion batteries. So we look at the structure of trade and also the structure of trade for those inputs that are used in the production of those goods. We also look at solar panels. We look at hydrogen technologies and some rare earth metal. The third argument that has been proposed for investing into more resilience in value chains is related to a somewhat different argument. It is that in some particular value chains, shortages or disruptions might induce non-economic losses. So the typical example is in the health sector. If you're lacking drugs to cure some disease, it might be particularly costly. So what this means is that in some product market, there might be a public good element in the supply of goods, and which means that the way the risk efficiency trade-off I started with is evaluated by the society might differ systematically from the evaluation of this trade-off by the private sector. So in that case, there might be an argument for public interventions. Here as well, in order to kind of think about these issues, what we do is to dig further into trade vulnerabilities in a particular sector. So what we do is to focus on active pharmaceutical ingredients, which happens to be goods that a lot of people think are kind of critical goods that also provide public services to the society, and also happen to be very easy to identify in trade data. So we can be very precise about the structure of trade for these particular active pharmaceutical ingredients. And again, what we do is to go through the list of those ingredients and look at those that are particularly concentrated at the worldwide level in terms of the structure of trade, to identify some of those drugs that might be particularly risky and in which we might want to invest further. The last argument, and I think Moritz is going to talk about this further afterwards, so I won't spend too much time on this, is related to this idea that international trade might be weaponized in the context of increasing geopolitical tensions. So here the way you might want to think about this is that the structure of trade not only might impose some economic cost, but can also affect the opportunity cost of war and thus the probability of conflicts. And so this means that some trade dependencies vis-à-vis countries that are not thought as being friends countries might be particularly risky. Again, in order to tackle this thing, what we do is to cross our measure of trade vulnerability with a measure of geopolitical risk, which we take from the literature, and again focus on the subset of product markets that involve trade dependencies vis-à-vis countries that are measured as being high in the distribution of geopolitical risk. So all the details, of course, are given in the paper if you want to know more, but I'm going just to conclude on this. So what we just did is to kind of use as much data as we can so that to try measure in the data potential vulnerabilities that are related to the structure of trade between Europe and the rest of the world. Once you have this kind of diagnosis, the last step is to set up policies that can be efficient in reaching more resilience through international trade. And again, to think of these questions, I think it's useful to think about the type of externalities that we have in mind when we discuss this type of policies. So in the literature, most of the externalities that have been discussed are related to either information or network externalities. Information externalities are related to the fact that the structure of global value chains has become so complex that nowadays it's very difficult for firms and countries to evaluate their exposure to international trade. And the reason is that usually a firm is going to have a very good view of the kind of level 1 exposure to different countries and product market, but above this, the structure of those value chains makes it very difficult for firms to evaluate their own exposure to risk. So in order to solve this type of information externalities, one good policy involves providing more information to private firms. And in the paper, we discuss in details what type of data already exists within the European Union that could be used to provide such information. The second set of externalities that the literature has focused on are network externalities. So I already mentioned this in those global value chains because all firms are interdependent to each other. Everybody is going to benefit from more investment into resilience at one point of the network, and because of this, there is underinvestment in equilibrium. So in that case, in theory, we know what to do. We know that we need to set up a complex structure of tax and subsidies so that to incentivize investment in resilience at the fragile nodes of the network. In theory, it is relatively easy. In practice, we know it's going to be extremely difficult because we usually don't have the full picture of the network. So what we know or kind of think is that it's probably more important to invest into upstream industries, again, because this is where there will be more amplification. But this, beyond this, it's a bit difficult to think about the optimal way of designing this type of policies. The last difficulty that I wanted to mention, and then I'll stop, I don't know how I'm doing in terms of the time, is the fact that in the very context of the European Union, these questions are further complicated by the fact that public subsidies that are going to be used so that to incentivize this resilience investment are the competency of the member states within the European Union, while being also regulated through the European law. And so that means that there is a bit of a governance issue that is all the more important since, again, this investment in resilience are going to be a public good for the Europe as a whole. So in this situation, we know that coordinating those policies is going to be very important, but this is not exactly what we are doing right now. Again, these are competence of the member states. And so we are having a set of industrial policies that are uncoordinated across member states that might induce some issues, and in particular reinforcing some of the pre-existing current imbalances. So we need to think about how to coordinate this type of policies, and I think there will be more discussion about this in the rest of the panel. So I'm going to stop here.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Isabelle. We have the general discussion at the end, so move straight to Moritz, who also has a little bit less than 20 minutes, please.
Wonderful, thank you. And let me start by thanking Beatrice and Jeromin and Jean for inviting us to do this work. It's I'm very, very pleased to be here on this great panel. This is a joint effort. There's a long list of co-authors, and they are partly identical with the group that wrote the What If paper last year when it was about the Russian gas embargo, the Russian stop of Russian gas deliveries to Germany. The question here is very similar. The setup is very similar, but the question is one that has a slightly different focus. Namely, we look at the effects of a hard decoupling from China on the German economy, and so to give you some context, Germany and China have been in a very close trade relations over the last 20 years. China is Germany's largest trading partner these days, and I think there is very little doubt as well that the German economy was one of the main beneficiaries of China's rise in the world economy in the past two or three decades, given its exposure to capital goods and in other industries. So this was the rapprochement, if you will, over the last 20 years economically, and this is what we look at now. What happens if we go different ways? Okay. So what's the roadmap going to be for my talk? And it's in one of these rare events where you've been given 15 minutes, and now it's a little more. So I look forward to being a little bit. Taking some time. So we're going to talk a little bit. I'm going to talk a little bit about the economic context, namely China's and Germany's economic relations, trade relations specifically. Then introduce the model and the key results, and talk a little bit about the caveats of this analysis. Let me when I talk about the economic context and the roadmap, let me start with the I think the obvious one, which is that. We're using a model that it has, has like 50 countries and 60 sectors, something like that. So it is complex and it has all kinds of production and network structures, but it's still a model. So it's going to be, a very rough approximation of what's going on in the real world. And the way we think about this, and the way we also thought about the Russia paper last year, was to give policymakers and give the public a broad idea about what this would entail. So we have the discussion later, but this is certainly not a paper where you want to argue about is the effect going to be 4.2 or 4.6% of GDP. This is more like, is this going to be a major economic devastation, catastrophe like the Great Depression? Is this a severe shock, maybe like the global financial crisis or COVID? Or is this going to cause more of a normal recession? In the Russian case, we said likely more of a normal recession, and I think that worked out well. So this is the big picture here as well. Hard decoupling from China. What should we think about? How should we think about this in terms of the consequences for the German economy? And this is Germany is the most, with the Netherlands together, the most exposed to China in Europe. But obviously in the paper, in the longer version also we'll have all the results, including for China herself and the other European countries. But I can tell you Germany is with the Netherlands the most exposed, so all the other effects are going to be smaller for the European countries. The biggest loser here is going to be China overall because of the setup that I'm going to talk about now. Okay, economic context. So German imports from China, you see here the imports by the HS6 product group. There is across the board some variation in how import-dependent Germany is on China. You also see that the main, the highest import shares, and if you will, the most concentrated product groups are still in areas such as rawhide, skins, leathers, and furs, which probably are not very strategic. Footwear and headgear is also in there. But then obviously there are also some product groups where the dependence is very high. On average, I think we have a picture that this table also confirms, where the share of China in total trade is about, it is on the import side here in relation to GNE, not GDP. So we do this in relation to GNE, gross national expenditure, because that is not affected by terms of trade changes, and the share here is 7%. This is 2019 data. It might be a little bit higher now. You see across some of these industries, machinery, electrical, transportation, miscellaneous, these effects are a little bit, the shares are a little bit bigger. And then in terms of the share of total sector trade in GNE, we're talking about something like 32%. These are meaningful numbers. These are roughly, we're talking about something like 3-4 times the Russia numbers overall. But again, it also gives you a picture. This is not, this is a 7% of total trade. It's not 80 or 90%. And some of the numbers that are circulating in Berlin suggest, are already painting very dire scenarios. So important part here is, like, we're talking about something on the import side and on the export side, roughly somewhere around 8% maybe of GNE. Okay, the model is what we used last year. It's the Bakefari Networks, Barriers and Trade model. It's a trade model with international production networks. And more important is that what we model really is, you can think of this as a Cold War 2.0 scenario. So it's not only Germany decoupling from China, it's the entire Western, I call it Western here, being aware of the problematic word, the entire Western bloc ceasing to trade with China. And so all the trade that is done between the EU, US, and all the other G7 players and China today has to be rerouted to be either trade within the Friends group, within the West, or between the West or the Friends and the neutrals. So 3 geo-economic blocks: Friends, the rivals is China and Russia, and then the neutrals, which are, in our case, 11 countries, roughly 31% of world GDP. The Friends, the Western bloc, if you will, is roughly 50% of world GDP. And the model, what we model here is a hard decoupling between the Friends and the rivals, so the West and China, across all economies, and then we zoom in on what this would mean for Germany. So all the trade that's happening right now with China and the West is gone. This is really Cold War 2.0, and it is extreme. It is an extreme scenario. I think it's important to underline that. So we're talking about total decoupling between Friends and rivals. The key parameters, I think this is something that we discussed last year a lot when we're talking about even prime time TV debates about elasticities of substitution in Germany. I'm not sure how many people really understood what this is about, but again, here the elasticity is also going to matter a lot. And it turns out, and this was new to me, maybe it's always been clear to people that are more on the trade side, that the trade elasticities are really what makes the big difference. So the assumptions about how quickly we can reroute the trade and how trade responds to that increase in trade cost is the biggest effect. Has the biggest effect. So that assumption, what you put in there for the trade elasticity, much more than the sectoral and the factor elasticities is gonna give you is going to govern the economic effects of the decoupling. And we're going to calibrate this all with the latest data from the World Input-Output database, and latest data sounds great, but the latest data is from 2014 or 2015. So keep that in mind. This is as good as it gets, but the input-output data are not super recent. We have done a little bit of a back-of-the-envelope calculation how this China's weight in trade has grown since then, how this would affect our estimates. For Germany, probably not, because the China share has not increased that much. It might come down a little bit for China because China is much less, but less trade open today than it was in 2014. So what do we do about these elasticities? We do what we also did last year in the gas study. We go to the empirical literature and screen everything that looks serious to us and make very conservative, like look at the elasticities that people have estimated empirically over different horizons. Generally, we'll always stay on the very conservative side. So the number we're going to give you for short-run elasticity is the lowest number we could find anywhere in the literature. And then also out for the long term, I think we have a standard trade elasticity of 4 baked in there. Nothing that is outrageous at all. But let me emphasize that I think if you disagree with the overall result here, you need to disagree. You essentially, and you want to stay in the argumentative context of that model, you need to want to make an argument about trade elasticities being very different from what we put in here. That's what changes things. Yeah. Okay, so this is, I think, one of the most important charts, and one that we are, I guess, also contributing most relative to the decoupling papers. There's some out there. It's a little bit of what you could call a fake dynamics, because what we plot here is the time horizon, and then from different studies, the trade elasticities that people have estimated over these different horizons. So if you take the first one, the Feigelbaum et al. 2020, this is basically an event study of the Trump tariffs, and they estimate a very short-run trade elasticity in response to that Trump episode. And I think they come out at something like 0.5 over a 2-month period. So a very relatively low number. And then as you go up to a year, then Feigelbaum et al. Say it's about 1.5. There's a study by Sandkamp 2020 arguing it's more closer to 2. And then if you go to the long run, and long run we mean 9-10 years plus, then Simonovska and Mike have a nice paper, and they all come out at roughly 4. So we get this sort of curve over for elasticities over time, and depending on which of these elasticities we look at, depending on what the time dimension is that we're interested in for the economic effects, we come to different results. I'm going to show you those in a second. But this is so if you think about what is the short-run cost of a hard decoupling, what is the medium-run and the long-run cost, those will be the elasticities we use to calculate until we end up with this long-run trade elasticity of 4. Okay, this is what comes out. This is sort of the key chart. For the for the different trade elasticities, as I mentioned, the short run 0.5, then for 1 year we use 1.5. Then for the medium run, which we call 3 years or so, we use 3, and for the long run 4. And the benchmark is in the very short run, and then you have the second column on the right where we say very low elasticities for all the other elasticities in the model, which, as you can see, basically don't change the picture all too much. This is why I'm talking so much about the trade elasticity. Our our house number, if you will, is we come out that the short run impact, think about this as the first few months, maybe half a year, is something like a welfare loss in the vicinity of 5%. That falls as we go along. So this is the 5% here, a very short run, and then as you have more time to reorient trade, to find new suppliers, to deal with all these frictions in sort of rearranging and readjusting trade, these the costs fall until they settle at this long run estimate, which is, I think, roughly 1.5%, which is a permanent loss. Obviously, we're poorer because we can't trade with China anymore. You also see, if we then do crazy things like putting that trade elasticity to 0.1 or 0.25, which is nowhere to be found in the literature. Also, these results don't get much larger anymore. Then we're maybe at 5.9 or 5.6% of GDP over the first few months, or GNE, I should say. But it's not a sort of order of magnitude different. Yeah? So 5% to us seems a good number, and 5% is, it's severe. It's a big drop. But it's not devastating. That's kind of what we come. It's severe but devastating. Last year we said substantial but manageable. This is severe but not devastating. It's in line with shocks that we have dealt with before. Okay, let me continue now out of time. So this is the short run, and sort of, if you will, if you agree with this, is some kind of fake dynamics that you can think about in the context of a static trade model. So you need to take this with a grain of salt. But these are the effects that you get over time if you just mechanically change these trade elasticities. How does the long run look like? Well, this is the world economy as it is today. So we have the friends; they trade with the rivals and the neutrals. These are in percent of global GDP. So right now, the friends, the rivals, this is China and Russia, trade about or send about 1.5% of global GDP worth to the friends. That's roughly $1.5 trillion. We have $100 trillion global GDP, roughly. And we send back 960 billion. And then we trade with the neutrals, and the rivals trade with the neutrals. And what happens in the long run is, of course, that the friends and the rivals do not trade at all anymore, and trade gets rerouted into more trade within the friend group, and especially more trade between the friends and the neutrals. So the Indias and the Brazils of this world are going to be, the Mexicos, I guess, are going to be the beneficiaries. The effect of trade within the rivals is negligible. There isn't that much. Okay, so. Let's say, what does it mean for policy? And Isabelle hasn't stopped me. Beatrice, you haven't stopped me out, so I will. I'll continue. What does it mean for policy? You see here something that is a very stylized way of how we think about the choices at this stage. So the solid line is are the costs that we estimate over these different horizons. So 5% roughly on impact in the first few months, and then going down to 3% after a year, and then going up to 1.5% in the long run. And there are these dashed lines, and there's a gradual decoupling, which is this line where we say, like, okay, we gradually prepare for a hard decoupling, which is, I don't think that's a policy option that's really on the table, but you get the idea by gradually, by only applying these very high or very low short-run elasticities that are so costly to a percentage of trade, not to all of trade, you can buffer the costs. And then there's also like this nice de-risking line, which means like, okay, you de-risk, you don't decouple, you reduce trade in maybe sensitive areas to a degree that the West feels more comfortable with. But again, you see there is a permanent loss. Of course, there's a permanent welfare loss. We do decrease trade. We intervene actively, and that will turn out, I'll talk about this at the very end a little bit, that will turn out to be, I think, a crucial ingredient if you think about the optimal policy in this world. You trade like a permanent welfare loss right now through de-risking or gradual decoupling for an uncertain event in the future. At the potential benefit that you avoid these very large short-run costs if there is a conflict, say, over Taiwan. So I think that's the way to frame this. So some caveats, and I'm going to be quick on this. Well, there's short-run business cycle amplification. This is this is not in here, and from the Russian case last year, we think that the short-run cost could add up to 30%. At least my former colleagues there did a nice Hank model and say like could be 30% larger. So maybe we're talking about 6.5% in the short run and not about 5%. But again, the magnitude is in that ball camp. Dynamic effects on investment capital accumulation, maybe a little bit, but recent papers make the point that the effects are rather small. There's a lot of talk in Germany about about the fate of direct investment. German FDI stocks in China are about 2.74% of German GDP. Already doesn't sound all that much in terms of the numbers. Profits, FDI profits that German companies make in China are 0.44% of GDP. So, these are in nominal euros, these are big numbers, but relative to the size of the German economy, they're not overly large. Then there's the issue with strategic raw materials, and that's something I think that we need to look at, and Isabelle did a great job in doing this. Let me just give you some stats on the FDI and then close. So there are about 2,400 German companies active in China with 750,000 employees, having a turnover of 330 billion. These are big numbers that get thrown around in the public domain, but relative, there are 40,000 companies outside Germany, so it's about 5%, with 8 million workers, much larger, with annual turnover of 3 trillion euros. So in comparison to what's out there in terms of German FDI, these numbers Again, big in certain sectors, but not big in terms of the overall economy.
Moritz?
Strategic raw materials, I skip because Isabelle has really nicely brought that. There's a few, these gallium, magnesium, rare earth, and tungsten, which are used in the automotive industry and where China is a big supplier and diversification is difficult. But again, it's more of a sectoral issue. Automotive is 4% of German GDP and shrinking as things are going right now. Okay, so last word. The economic impact depends critically on the time horizon. Cold turkey, hard decoupling would have severe short-run effects, but not devastating effects. We think about the shock comparable to the GFC or COVID. Gradual decoupling and gradual de-risking could avoid the short-run effects, but would bring permanent welfare losses, and we need to think about this more generally. Optimal policy will depend on the probability of conflict and also on the Isabelle mentioned this, on the effect of de-risking and decoupling on the probability of conflict. And there's the one view where less trade makes the opportunity cost of war goes down. On the other hand, in the Russian case, I think the argument was the other one, which was like, oh, we wouldn't defend Ukraine or we wouldn't defend Taiwan because we are so dependent. So it's a little bit unclear in which way that argument actually goes in practice. I leave it here. Thanks, Beatrice.
Thank you very much, Moritz. Okay, so Morgan, you're next.
Okay, can I swap with Moritz?
Oh, you want to see it? Yeah, of course. Of course.
You'll see my slides otherwise. Okay.
It's a little bit.
And is the clicker? Yeah. Oh, brilliant. Thanks. Okay, well, thanks very much, everyone. Nice to be here. So, as part of the project, then, Kevin and I were asked to give you folks a historical background. So, what you've got is, since the rise of organized states in the 16th century, governments have been engaged in trying to improve the technological levels of their economies. They wanted to bring in foreign technology, they want to come up with better technology of their own, and if they've got that, they want to stop foreigners from getting this technology. So what it means then is that from perspectives of historians like us, the period 1980 to 2020 is historically anomalous. Okay? This is a period where you do not have active industrial policy. And so what was going on then? I think there are two factors. Okay? First is you have neoliberalism. Okay? You have this sort of Reagan-Thatcher view that government intervention, any sort of intervention, is going to be ineffective at best. The second thing is, as Moritz was pointing out, that period was very much the interlude between the First and Second Cold Wars. Okay, that no one, say, West has beaten the Russians, and these Chinese are convivial chaps that we can do business with. And now, as you know, Moritz says, no, we're going to be kicking their asses very, very shortly. So what we have then, the paper with Kevin, we cover a lot of ground, okay, several hundred years. We look at trade policy, we look at factor market interventions, and I'm not going to tell you an entire economic history of the world in 15 minutes. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to look at England and France during the Industrial Revolution. So what you've got then, you've got England coming up with new technology, you've got the French who want this technology, and then you've got a situation where these guys are in a continuous state of war, which is becoming increasingly intense through time. Okay, if you look at the rest of Europe, they have very much a similar pattern to each other afterwards. Okay, you've got government, developing schools, railways, tariffs, banks, heavy industry for military purposes. Okay, but we're going to be focusing on this early period. Our approach here is no narrative, old-fashioned bullshitting. What you've got is you've got a big econometric literature which uses various identification strategies to test historical trade policies and say there's a big review by Juhasz and Steinwender. The difficulty with these analyses, these guys are using spatial data. The econometric techniques these guys are using are basically guaranteed to give you absolutely stupendous levels of significance, which are entirely spurious. So Tim Conley and I then we've come up with some simple diagnostics, placebo test, a sort of synthetic outcome test to handle situations like this. And what you find is that most of these results are more or less entirely spurious. So caveat lector, folks. Okay, so what are the common patterns that we find, the lessons of history? First thing is that big advances are very often associated with migration of workers. Okay? These guys embody skills. So what it means then is that immigration policy is a central part of industrial policy, okay? Something that is very often overlooked. The second thing is that governments need to build on the existing strengths of their economies. That great leap forwards typically fail, and they fail expensively. And the third thing is that if push comes to shove, import substitution and also military muscle can be very, very useful in maintaining supply chains. Okay, so talking about then people and skills. So historically then, machinery was very, very primitive. Skills were embodied in people. So if you wanted to develop new technologies, you had to bring in people. And for some processes, this is very, very straightforward. Like you think of something like, say, cotton spinning in the 18th century, you've got little simple wooden machines. It was very easy for the French to get various English guys to come in and show them how to do it. However, lots of industrial processes, you've got lots and lots of stages. You need to have specific guys who can do each bit of it. And so, for example, say iron making, you need guys to make the fuel, to design the furnaces, build the furnaces, run them, all this sort of stuff you're familiar with. And so the difficulty you face then is that if you're looking for foreign workers, the good guys that you want are obviously highly paid, they're not going to leave. And the guys you end up with are mostly trying to flee their wives or their creditors, and they're completely incompetent. So this was a big, big problem. At the same time, then occasionally, say the British had very fortuitous influxes of religious refugees. What you had is, you probably all know about the Huguenots in the late 17th century. They were driven out of France and they brought all these cool new technologies to Britain. Probably more important are Walloons in the 1570s. Okay? So these are no Dutch Protestants escaping the Spanish. And these guys are coming from the most economically sophisticated part of Europe to somewhere that's still pretty peripheral and backward at the time. So they're bringing along these sort of very new fabrics which turn out to be ultra successful, and also then modern capitalist ways of doing business. When you come up then to, leaving aside, catching up, moving ahead then, you've got guys that are coming up with brilliant ideas, and you need to then go and produce these. So what it means is you need to have skilled workers that you can move from one activity to the new ones. And again, this is a big advantage the British had, that they had lots of various skilled workers. And so, for example, when they go to build more complex textile machines, say the gearing on these things is made by local clockmakers and watchmakers. They had a huge, big industry doing this. In France, say by contrast, you've got guilds where each person can only train one apprentice in a lifetime. One apprentice at a time. It slows things down markedly. All righty. So what we want to do then is look at a bunch of failures and successes. So one of the biggest failures is coal-based metallurgy in France. So you had, basically from the Middle Ages, the English had been working on developing coal as a source of industrial fuel. And by the 18th century, they're starting to use this to make cast iron, which is vital. You can make really good cannons. And also then, they're making steel, which makes very good files. And files are vital. They're the machine tools of their time. So if you want to put together a musket lock, you have to go and you have to file all the little bits. So the French wanted this technology very, very badly. So they sent in various spies who would go along, chat to factory owners. They tried to get various workers, ply them with drink, and so on. But it didn't work. Basically, they end up building a very large state-of-the-art ironworks in Le Creusot, and it's a complete failure. It's just there's too much of a jump from their charcoal-based iron to English, coal-based iron. This changes then after 1815. You have a big influx of English artisans. So these guys now are building modern factories, ironworks, railways. No trains here, I believe, still go on the left. And so you've also got then machine tools appearing. Now, these let you shape metal. And so you're in a situation then that a farm boy turning a handle can do in a few minutes what one of these skilled Birmingham artisans would have taken days to be able to do. So if we jump then to the end of the 19th century, you're not concerned with iron cannon anymore. What people want is they want German-style steel artillery. And once again, you big efforts to build up this technology, most notably in Japan, where they developed then a very large and ultimately successful steel industry. On the other hand, then, the French are very, very successful in chemistry. So at the end of the 18th century, most of the best chemists in Europe are in France. And what you've got is that there's a very strong ethos of public service, that you have close contacts with the government through the academy, and they've also got very close ties to industry. These guys work as consultants. Very many of them actually are partners or own chemical plants themselves. So what you have then is, in the Ancien regime, you have leading chemists being involved in dyes, in porcelain, and one massive invention they come up with is bleach. That previously, to bleach cloth, you soak it in buttermilk, leave it out in the sun for months. Instead, you just dunk it in chlorine bleach. It's done immediately. In the revolution, then, the big concerns are import substitution, because the Brits have cut off various stuff on them, and also then military supplies. So once again, using sort of new chemistry, they come up with alkalis for soap, they come up with saltpeter for gunpowder, leather soles for boots you can do very quickly, canning, sugar beet, all of these sorts of things. Look at Britain then. Their big concern of government is with shipping. And a big thing is shipping safety. And so the Brits put in a lot of effort to improving navigation. But they come up with a very sophisticated technique called lunar distances, where you can figure out where you are by looking at the distance between a moon and a star. It's way too complex. They also then come up with chronometers, but these are too expensive and unreliable. They only start getting used in the mid-19th century. And so before that, basically, you have big, big improvements in safety at sea, but these are driven by ordinary sailors. So you've got basically better maps, you have better navigation manuals. Another thing then is having a big navy allows the British then to maintain their supply lines. Okay, they can continue bringing in food, supplies in wartime, and they can disrupt then the supply chains of others. And this is obviously done most ferociously and effectively in the First World War. The Germans are importing very large amounts of food and very large amounts of nitrates to make fertilizer and to make explosive. And these are cut off entirely. So the Germans then have synthetic nitrogen, but they can only produce shells, not fertilizer. So the Germans slowly starve to death. The British themselves, though, do have one big Achilles heel, and this is the Baltic. That basically everything the British used for making ships came from within the Baltic. And so, as you know, the Baltic is now an inland sea. So in Napoleonic times, then you had Napoleon trying to cut them off from it. So they went to huge efforts trying to get substitute goods around the world. That didn't work. Instead, they had to force big convoys into the Baltic. And this also, as well as getting supplies, this allowed them to get around Napoleon's continental system. You could bring goods into Germany and then, or eastern, into the Baltics, and bring them around then. Okay, one thing then that is very different than now is you have chartered trading companies. So a very profitable thing to do was to go off now and conquer other guys, kill the natives, take all their goods, start growing sugar and tobacco and shipping them back and processing them and shipping them on. And this was too expensive for governments to manage. Remember, these guys had very shaky fiscal bases. So you have then joint stock companies given monopolies to do these sorts of things. Moving into the steamship era then, you have one big intervention, which is the British Post Office subsidises Cunard. They give these very big subsidies to transatlantic mail with the explicit goal of improving steam navigation. One of their most ambitious schemes, however, were the Navigation Acts in the mid-17th century. So you had then, up to the middle of the 17th century, the Dutch were the dominant carriers around European waters. And the British then decided they wanted in on this. And they did two things. First is they fought a series of wars against the Dutch. And the first one, it's massively successful. They capture a big chunk of the Dutch merchant fleet, okay, about 1,000 ships. 2 minutes, okay. Okay, so Navigation Acts then, they limit these guys, you can only bring goods in British vessels. Did this work? What we do is we look at the sound tolls, ships going in and out of the Baltic. What we find is that, say, numbers, 20-year intervals on either side, you've got a constant number of ships, a constant number of Dutch ships, but the number of British ships doubles in this time. So Adam Smith felt these were a big deal. He seems to have been correct. Okay, so I'm basically pretty much, I've been told I've only got no time left, so I'm just going to stop. Okay, thanks, guys.
Okay. Thank you, Mauro. I didn't want to be that abrupt, but we still have time to get back. Chad, you're next.
Thank you, Beatrice. It's a huge pleasure to be here. So I'm Chad Bown. I'm also American. Thank you, Linda. Which raises the question of why am I here? We're talking. Exactly. Okay. So let me frame this a little bit. So first of all, and this I'm going to talk about. My paper is going to be very complementary to what you've heard so far. I hope. Not as good, but very complementary, especially to what Isabelle and Moritz have put out there. So one reason why I might have been invited when it comes to this kind of decoupling economic security, de-risking strategy is, while it was not originally maybe the intention for the United States to do this, we're slightly farther along in the process of de-risking with China, given the actions of the Trump administration's tariffs that began back in 2018. So maybe there are lessons there. Second reason is I am a keen watcher of EU trade policy and DG trade, and appreciate and recognize their adherence to rules and the WTO. And so what I'm going to try to do today, sort of along the lines of what Isabelle did in terms of talking about toolboxes and the policy availability, is to provide a little institutional context about what policies are coming online, especially that DG Trade has been introducing and the Commission has been introducing over the last couple of years, to potentially handle these issues, to really walk through where they may be useful, where they may not be useful, and then talk about as well what some other countries around the world are doing in this space to deal with the question of de-risking, especially from China. But then finally, I'm going to pose a question to all of my European friends, which is, allies, in the presentations we've heard so far, why are you guys thinking about doing this all by yourselves? It seems like there could be a lot of coordination, especially for the countries that have very similar objectives. But that in and of itself requires policy cooperation, new institutional arrangements that we've never done before when it comes to things like industrial policy and the coordination of that. And so that's where I'll be going. Okay. A lot of my presentation I don't actually need to give because the setup is already there. But obviously it sort of stems from, and so Marcy, you said hard decoupling. Who uses the word decoupling anymore? Since March 30th, we've all been told to use de-risking. Even in the United States, we've now adopted President von der Leyen's de-risking language here. So it sort of very much stems from this perspective. The outline of the paper is here. Economic security, first I'll define it, and then talk a little bit of historical context, how we got here. The main gist of what I'm going to spend my 15 to 20 minutes on today is this one case study of Europe's tough choices, and then I'll walk through some of the policy implications and what we're seeing out there in the real world. So what is economic security? It's not really, I don't think, been clearly defined anywhere yet. But I guess what I would point to is this last bullet point, where it's recognition that there may be policymakers out there that are actively working against my interests, right? And they may be working against my interests because they want to start a war or position themselves for, or they may be doing it because they're worried about my industry growing faster than theirs or some sort of technological superiority argument. And there's going to be various ways that they might weaponize things. But in any case, there's multiple potential objectives that these foreign malicious policymakers might have. But the kind of the framework, as I see it, what differentiates this concern, modern concern about economic security from, say, supply chain resilience, right? Which was, out of recognition of the last couple of years, we're increasingly concerned about climate shocks. So floods, droughts, things like that. We're now worried about public health shocks after the experience with pandemics. Well, economic security differentiates from that in sort of a strategic setting of the potential malevolent or malicious foreign policymaker. Okay, but the case study that I want to focus my time on is this one of electric vehicles. So in September, President von der Leyen said that the Commission was going to launch an anti-subsidy investigation into Chinese electric vehicles. And China immediately responded by calling this a naked protectionist act. The Commission eventually started the investigation, self-initiated the investigation in October. And so what's the story behind this? Well, you look at the data and the story is pretty clear. There's been a massive surge in imports of battery electric vehicles from China into the European Union. This is where a huge chunk of the Chinese EVs are going. And clearly where they're not going is into the United States. And part of that is a legacy of the trade war and the tariffs. We imposed 25% tariffs on all vehicles from China back in 2018. But as a legacy of that, we have not seen any, basically, electric vehicles from China coming in. The EU, you're the major foreign market for these things. Now, obviously, at this point, a lot of them are still, Volkswagens and Teslas, so Western brands. Those were the early ones that were coming in. But now we're, I think, starting to see more and more indigenous Chinese brands, right? And the argument is these were unfairly subsidized. There's some papers out there that have, or research that has documented the extent to which Chinese battery companies, CATL, for example, was heavily subsidized and how that may be feeding downstream into the EV industry itself in ways that are unfair. So the EU has started an investigation, and this thing could ultimately, under a law in the EU that is perfectly consistent with its obligations, a rules-based approach to dealing with this underlying challenge. All WTO members can have one of these anti-subsidy laws. You find evidence of injury to your domestic industry caused by foreign subsidized imports, you're allowed under WTO rules to impose tariffs. All the EU has done so far is announce an investigation. So China immediately announced that they were going to retaliate. And historically, China has been known to retaliate against other countries' use of these potentially WTO-consistent trade defense instruments, whether it's anti-dumping duties, countervailing duties. China has done this in the past against the United States. It's done it in the past against Europe, whether it was on X-ray machines, certain steel products. But what's interesting this time around is, in the past, China has typically imposed its own trade defense instruments against, European exports, say. This time around, what China said was, we are going to restrict exports of graphite. We're going to weaponize trade. We're going to weaponize a critical input, a critical material, one of the ones, potentially, that Isabelle already identified as potentially being of an import dependency, right? Something that we'd be concerned about. Exactly this scenario of worrying about de-risking, right? Okay, so we look at the data, and this is the Chinese trade data. So this is the most disaggregated data. Who buys the most Chinese exports of the graphite products that China has said it's going to impose export restrictions on? Well, the EU is the biggest destination market. And within the EU, it's primarily Poland, Hungary, and Germany, okay? Also, look at the next biggest markets. It's the United States, Korea, Japan. These are all countries now that are building out battery electric vehicle plants. So graphite, why it's important for this story, is it's a critical material that you need to make the anodes that go into these new battery electric vehicles, right? That everybody, all of us, the US, Europe, China, Japan, Korea, that have big auto industries that are transitioning into green vehicles, need to be able to power these things. Okay? So the question is, so China, what they have said is starting December 1st, so starting last week, I guess, they're going to have an export licensing system based on national security. And what that means is they're going to be able to discriminate across foreign buyers and say, yeah, you're allowed to have our graphite and you're not, right? So it's worth thinking about different scenarios and how they might choose to discriminate, right? WTO rules are supposed to do this on an export on an MFN basis. You're not supposed to discriminate against potential buyers of your products. Well, I guess I maybe have this completely backward. They may want to discriminate only against the United States and really just offer their graphite to Europe, to thank Europe for doing an anti-subsidy investigation into their electric. I don't think that's the case, but it's possible. So maybe they're driving a wedge between the United States and Europe, the potential ally story, right? Alternatively, they may be trying to drive a wedge between EU member states, right? So when you look at, and so this chart here, and I realize the fonts are small, you can't see it, but this is where the location of the batteries for these electric vehicle plants are popping up across different EU member states. And the red bars are where the Chinese foreign investments are popping up across Europe. So the biggest location of these facilities is so far in Germany, Hungary, and Poland. Remember, the first chart showed you that was the main source of buying the Chinese graphite. Well, in Germany, there is a lot of investment from CATL, the sort of leading Chinese battery company, in Hungary also. But in other EU member states, there's basically no Chinese investment, right? Portugal is LG, so a major Korean battery manufacturer. Other member states, it's domestic indigenous, Northvolt, other European companies. So maybe the strategy of the Chinese government would be, well, we'll try to play off EU member states against each other in this story. We'll give licenses to CATL for its plant in Hungary, but we won't give licenses to Northvolt or LG, one of the Korean companies, for their plants in Portugal or Germany or somewhere like that, right? Okay, so you can see the question is how might they operationalize or weaponize this in practice? And then the follow-up question to that, and I'll come back to this in a moment, is supposing they do something like that, does the EU today currently have the right policy tools to address it? And so over the last couple of years, they have been developing something called the anti-coercion instrument, right? After what happened to Lithuania, opened up the office for Taiwan, China retaliated. There wasn't an institutional legal way for the EU to do something about this. They tried to develop a new policy instrument to discourage those types of actions. Another one is the foreign subsidies regulation. The Commission has been worried that Chinese investment into Europe that may have linkages to state-owned firms back in China may be receiving subsidies that then creates an unlevel playing field vis-a-vis indigenous European firms or American or Korean or whomever firms in the EU market. Well, economically, if the Chinese government is allowing graphite to flow to Chinese subsidiaries in Hungary, but not allowing it to flow to, Northvolt European subsidiaries somewhere else, that sort of looks like a subsidy, right? So would that tool potentially be utilized to respond to a situation like this? Is that enough, or does the Commission need other tools to deal with this kind of thing? Okay. So now to this question of we've talked about de-risking, and we saw all the data that Isabelle had put together, and it's incredible. The question we might ask next is, should the EU have known about this graphite dependence and done something about it already to de-risk so that it wouldn't be subject to worrisome export restrictions that might otherwise influence its normal WTO rights to potentially impose tariffs for another country that has massively subsidized its industry. So when we look at the import data, and this is matching, again, the Chinese government has announced the 8-digit on the Chinese side product codes that it said it's going to impose these export restrictions on. The best we can do on the import side is to take the 6-digit data. That's the only thing that's comparable across countries. So when I look exactly at that data, I would look at that. That's the chart on the left. This is the EU's sources of these graphite products. We only get 22%. I'm European now. I've switched. We only get 22% of our graphite imports from China. 42% we get from South Korea, another 15% from the US, UK. There's no trade dependence there at all, or very little, right? And we can do HHIs, but I don't think it would be all that different, right? But the challenge is when you look at the production data, the global production data, and here this is the mining data for raw graphite, you see a very, very different story. China mines about 2/3 of the world's graphite. And so that earlier chart that I showed you that the biggest export destinations for Chinese graphite were, yes, Europe, but also the United States, South Korea, and Japan. This is basically saying that all of those countries import graphite from somewhere else. None of them mine their own graphite. If you look at that part chart on the right, none of those countries really mine their own graphite. They're all getting their graphite from somewhere else, likely China, processing it a little bit, and then exporting it amongst each other. The upshot is in the publicly available trade statistics that we have, even at their most granular level, I'm not sure we have enough information to really know where the dependencies lie. And I know this is a very particular example, and the trade data tells us something, but really we need to know production data and value added, and even the value added data that we have, and I've used the WEO data, it's the best data that we have available, is much more aggregated than this, right? And so it's really, really, really hard to de-risk proactively and to be sort of sure that you're going to cover all of your bases. Okay. Now, a separate question, though, is as Europe is thinking about this de-risking scenario, is its job being made harder by events outside of its control, right? And in particular, is the remnants of the US-China trade war actually making it more difficult? Is Europe essentially becoming more trade interdependent with China? Because the United States has decided starting 5 years ago that it was going to be less trade interdependent with China. So this is just a recollection. US imposed, we went from 3% MFN tariffs on China toward now our tariffs are about 20%. China did the same. And at the same time, China actually lowered its tariffs toward you during that period, toward the EU, right? So it retaliated against the United States, still has those higher tariffs in place, but it also lowered its tariffs toward the rest of the world. And all those tariffs are still there. So this is what's happening in the trade data. This is all Chinese exports, broken out by whether they go to the United States, Europe, or the rest of the world. So the question is, and this sort of gets to the question of trade deflection. So Meredith Crowley at Cambridge and I were working on a related issue almost 20 years ago now in the context of the Bush administration's steel tariffs. And the concern that Europe had, well, if the United States shuts its market for steel, is all the steel going to come to us? And we found, yeah, that's a plausible thing. Well, here's a similar kind of story, right? You're seeing some minor evidence, in the aggregate data at least, that China's exports to the US have fallen, but China's exports to the EU have grown. It becomes even more stark when you break it out by whether the products are hit with the US tariffs or not. The chart on the left, a third of what the United States was importing from China prior to the trade war were never hit with any tariffs. Okay? For those products, US imports from China are now higher than EU imports from China over that same time period. Yeah, still. But for the products that are subject to the 25% tariffs, there's a widening divergence, suggesting that China is exporting to the EU more and more, as at the same time it's exporting less to the United States. So if you're thinking about de-risking now from the European perspective, just sort of, if 2018 was your benchmark, you have an even harder job, right? Because you've got these economic forces that are sort of moving against you. And on the export side, EU exports to China, similar sort of story. China has never resumed its purchases of U.S. exports after the trade war, despite the infamous Phase 1 agreement where China promised it was going to buy an additional $200 billion of U.S. exports that President Trump said. Never happened, and especially didn't happen in automobiles. U.S. exports of China to automobiles are down about $5 or $6 billion at an annual level, and Europe's exports, which is primarily Germany and Slovakia, are up about that same amount, right? Okay. So, in my remaining 1 minute, here's my policy toolkit, right? I think it very much echoes what Isabelle had put up as well. Let me just say 2 words about industrial policy, and then I'll stop. And why I think it's more than, we need to treat this possibility as it's more than just reshoring and a subsidies race between the United States and Europe. There are some subsidies that we're seeing that are entry subsidies, come here, but we're actually seeing governments implement exit subsidies. Please leave China. And we'll give you money conditional on you leaving, but you don't necessarily have to come here, right? Or, relatedly, in the United States, in the Inflation Reduction Act for critical minerals, subsidies are there for things like cobalt, lithium, graphite, et cetera. Don't have to be for these things mined or processed in the United States, but in countries with which we have either free trade agreement or a critical minerals agreement. The argument is that this isn't industrial policy necessarily like we saw in earlier eras. I think there's deliberate recognition by at least some policymakers the benefits from international trade, the fragmentation of production, comparative advantage. And the question would be, if there is some desire for countries with common concerns and objectives to de-risk, is there a way to coordinate policies to do so? And if so, what sorts of policy instruments does that require? Subsidies, export controls, tariffs, investment regulations, etc. And with there, I'll stop. Okay. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Chad. So I did fail to mention at the beginning that this ITCEI project is a joint project, CEPR, with Bruegel. And hence we are now going to hear from Jeromin, who is a long-term fellow and friend who's been working on European issues together with a lot of the people at the different stages of our concern with Europe. So we continue this collaboration. And the challenge for us, the conveners, is now to, out of these 4 excellent papers, draw the lessons.
Okay, so I wasn't really sure what to do, and I had sort of 2 options, and I'm not going to take either of them. I'm going to completely improvise this. So the 2 options were essentially to do what Bea suggested, which is, the context is that, at Bruegel, my perception was that we were asked to provide sort of quick answers to economic security questions that simply cannot be answered based on the existing research, and that we are going, because the Commission is under heavy pressure to produce such answers, we're going to get a mixture of waste, garbage, and unintended consequences. And that's when we decided to have this project together to basically get papers like the one by Isabelle and Pierre that look at dependency, for example, in a way more sophisticated way than what the Commission had done. And only on that basis can we give policy advice. That was the idea. And so the next step of this is essentially for the 3 heads of this project, Beatrice, Jean, Pisani-Fer, and myself, to sit down and really synthesize what lessons we can draw from them. And I was not in a position to improvise this, certainly not without having talked to them before, right? So I sort of considered this, discarded it. Then I have something up there which was supposed to be my backup, which is a new it's a new presentation. It would have been, it's not a discussion of these things. It would have been the 5th presentation here. I think it's sort of an important angle. So roughly, you can think of the theme of these 4 papers as trying to diagnose problems and then inferring policy solutions from these problems. And this paper, this presentation up here does the reverse. It takes a set of policy solutions, which I call economic nationalism, and it wonders for which types of problems does this set of policies make sense, and does it ever make sense in advanced countries? So it would have turned it around. It would have been a nice complement to these papers if we had had yet another half hour, okay? But at this point, because these papers were so fantastic and you will want to ask questions, I'm simply going to skip this presentation. Instead, I will tell you what I picked up from these presentations, okay? It will take about 5 minutes. And then, and if you like, this is like a very loose discussion, right? And so even if you're completely silent, this will give the author something to react to, which will make it interesting. And I'm most definitely sure you're not going to be completely silent. Okay, so view this as sort of the first round of the discussion. So this is what I take away from these 4 papers.
This is why I love working with Jeromin.
He always improvises and then some very dubious stuff comes out.
It's always good.
Okay, so wait until the end. Okay, so Mejean and Rousseau. So my personal takeaways. The biggest takeaway for me, and I just love you for doing this, is how much of a difference bringing in substitutability makes. An order of magnitude, right? I mean, these bars, remember these bars? They come crashing down and through the little green bar at the end. So in other words, if you identify dependency purely based on the existing equilibrium, right, then, you know, any sort of specialization is going to be dependency. And what was completely unclear is whether then a shortage is going to lead to welfare losses or not, because, again, the substitutability matters. And so they have a substitutive measure and has very strong implications. And of course, what would be really interesting now is to look at the little residual number of goods, right, from, you know, 700 down to 49, I think, in the first slide. And then in the pharmaceutical slide, it was something like from, you know, several dozen down to 2, okay? So what are those goods? What do we do about them? But that, essentially, those slides validate this entire project. Or to put it in the language of our American friends, the yard is really small, or is potentially very small once you do the analysis right. So this argues for a surgical approach to economic security. The other interesting thing I took away is that not all instruments are heavy-handed. I mean, they depend essentially on the underlying distortion, right? So there were 2 broad classes of distortions: information externalities, network externalities. If the problem is information externalities, so firms, in principle, want to de-risk, right, for their own benefit. But they don't have the information, then just provide the information. I mean, that's not a heavy-handed tool. I don't think that the Chinese would necessarily retaliate against us if we did that. Now, that doesn't solve all problems. Once you're talking about network externalities, you might be sort of in this very difficult area of taxes and subsidies, Pigouvian-type taxes, right? And how are these designed? That's going to be very complicated, and we'll come back to that. Okay, the wonderful paper by Kiel and al., presented by Moritz, very strong takeaway, which he very clearly presented, which is that the costs are highly dependent on trade elasticities, and long-run trade elasticities lead to a cost, again, that is almost an order of magnitude smaller than the shorter run. So if you combine with this with sort of the Mejean and Rousseau message, what it says is it's a very strong case for sort of surgical, small fence, preventive de-risking, because it tells you it's going to be virtually costless, right? Even the complete decoupling scenario is pretty low cost if you do it very slowly. Imagine you only focus it on some things. Big caveat, strategic interactions are not there, right? I mean, or maybe they are, I'm not actually sure. I will let you answer that. But a very strong argument for actually taking this seriously, but taking sort of a very judicious preventive approach. Kelly and O'Rourke, really wonderful, also very nicely presented, and I'm going to give you an opportunity later to finish the presentation, I think, with my questions. But the main point for me is, you know, you have policy episodes that do pursue, I think, multiple or mixed motives, right? So as I would interpret them, and this is based on the paper as well as of the presentation, one motive is from the part of the British Empire to maintain rents, right? I mean, at some point in history, they had virtually a monopoly over sophisticated manufacturing goods. They clearly got rents out of this. And how did they try to maintain the rents? Well, through the 1660 Navigation Acts, and then there was the 71-81 attempt to ban exports of advanced machinery, right? Just don't give the others the technology. Another motive is catch-up. Now, this is in the case of France, of course. Other famous examples are the US, Germany, which Kelly did not cover, and this is sort of, the origins of this is what I call developmental economic nationalism, very nicely published in Hamilton's report on manufacturers, this idea, essentially the infant industry idea. And, you know, sometimes it seems to work. And then related to that, but different, is economic security. So economic security, I think, which is the main thing we are concerned with in this project, seems to me sort of to play a smaller role in the episodes that Morgan presented, but I may be wrong. So that's maybe something he may want to comment on. It's sometimes hard to separate from the catch-up argument, right? Because, you know, one of the reasons why you may want to catch up, the main reason I think is economic growth. But another reason is that you may want to be less dependent on unreliable foreign trade partners that may seek to exploit you, not just in an economic sense by capturing rents, but in a military sense too. Now, the thing that is unclear to me is, I mean, you have these failures, you have these successes. Can we say anything more general about when it works and when it doesn't work, right? And so that's essentially my main question. My main question to you, I mean, for, you know, post-World War II industrial policy episodes, there are sort of there's a bit of conventional wisdom, right? Industrial policy works when it's export-oriented, when you do not shut off imports of intermediate goods, when it involves coordination, you know, this is, but it doesn't work when you sort of do brutal import substitution, but then maybe sometimes it does work. I mean, these are all, it's sort of attempts to rationalize particular episodes, East Asia versus Latin America. I'm not sure whether you have lessons of this type, or even if you take those conventional wisdom lessons seriously. Okay, Chad. Well, a number of interesting things from Chad's presentations. One is, you know, this amazing EV slide. Tariffs work in reducing imports. You know, they actually flatline like that. Is this good or bad? I mean, if the objective is saving EU automotive jobs, maybe it's good. But if we take sort of this narrow fence approach to economic security, maybe it's bad. And so here's my question to Chad. You did not discuss this, and you're not a trade lawyer, but you always have to talk to economists as if you were a trade lawyer. So imagine we use Isabelle's and Pierre's paper as a formal argument to back sort of a Pigouvian taxation approach for economic or possibly even national security. If we actually implement this in Europe, so we really figure out where are the externalities the biggest on a product basis, where's the trade-off between, you know, efficiency and economic security such that we clearly want to tax a particular trade, so we impose tariffs. Could we just write down this policy and then send it to Geneva, accompanied by Isabelle's and Pierre's paper, and say, this is our justification for tariffs under the national security exemption in the WTO, and unlike the Americans, we're actually willing to go to Geneva and defend it and have Isabelle present the paper. Would we get away with that? So in other words, is there out there a possibility to use, you know, tariff-type solutions in a responsible way that is ring-fenced, that doesn't lead to essentially all hell breaking loose and multilateralism breaking down if we are sophisticated enough in how we think about this and defend it. Maybe my last point, I mean, policy coordination with the US. Yes, of course. I mean, but we do, right? We have the Trade and Technology Council. We also have NATO, we have OECD. There is the issue that when we seem to want to cooperate more bilaterally on these things, like with the TTC, we don't get very far. And when we cooperate in multilateral fora, that's great, but they're multilateral, which doesn't seem to be quite the spirit that you have in mind. And so I think the fundamental difficulty is that we may still be in slightly different worlds, in the sense that Europeans tend to put a bigger weight on the costs of this type of bilateral cooperation for multilateralism. Now, you would then say, but it's better than if you do it just by yourself, right? And that's definitely true. But, when we do it, we still play this lip service to multilateralism. And whenever we get sort of on the phone with the Biden administration and they say, why don't we do it together with you? They ask us to do horrible things, like, some steel and aluminum club that completely violates the rules. And so how are we going to get out of that? And this is, of course, in the best possible circumstances, because what might happen in November. And the final point, I know you're going to like this, because actually I stole the idea from you from another paper. Maybe, could it just be that effective de-risking requires cooperation with China? Not just with our allies, but also with our foes. I mean, it seems to me that if the big open flank of de-risking is that, we can take these unilateral measures, and then, the Chinese get mad, there's a trade war, all kinds of things happen. No? Now, Moritz's results gives us some reassurance that even if that happens, the cost might not be too big. But ideally, should we try to de-risk in a controlled way that basically tells China, look, conditioning on a certain amount of mistrust between us, which we should take as a given, let's have a cooperative approach to de-risking, a bit like arms control negotiations. Is that the way to go? And if it is the way to go, is there a way that Europeans could be persuaded to do this without sort of getting stuck with their multilateral hang-ups?
All right, thank you, Jeromin. So we did have a first round of presentations of the preliminary versions of these papers, and I do think that you have already drawn a lot of not only questions from them, but I'd like to open for the audience to ask questions and comments before we give it back to the authors. Yes, Eric. I think a microphone is coming.
Thanks a lot, Erik Nielsen. First of all, thanks a lot. That was some of the most exciting presentation I've heard for a long time. Really, 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 truly so. I have two related questions, but Jeromin sort of got close to it. But it started with Moritz's very nice estimation of sort of bad but not catastrophic. Is the issue not that type of process would never be smooth? That you would constantly run into issues that then generate...
I think you need the other microphone. It seems to keep it close to you.
Start again?
Yeah,
or
yeah better.
Yep. Okay, so many thanks for a fantastic presentation. I really enjoyed it. Two questions which are very related. Moritz, in your calculations or your estimation of what you, I think, described as very bad but not really very bad, it's like something along those lines. Is the real issue not sort of what Chad also talked about, the countermeasures from the other side? If you are making the total delinking or anywhere down the road, is there any possibility that that's a smooth process? Or is it not rather one that's going to come stop and go with other countermeasures that then leads to a number of supply shocks? And if so, how do one think about the effects of that, which could, I would think, be very, very bad? And the related question is, so a little bit like Jeromin's last comment to Chad, but I would take it one step further. Is there any prospect of rescuing the multilateral processes here? I mean, at all? I mean, it's or is it just WTO seems completely defunct now, right, de facto. But can anybody think about any sort of possibility of a managed process?
I think you can give it to Linda.
collecting?
Yes, go.
So, you know, I'm going to ask about the de-risking by concentrating, for example, raw materials extraction in Europe. And that concentration comes with a lot of dirty mining and environmental issues. And so what you would possibly get through this is a trade-off of these security gains through the de-risking gains with environmental losses. And so I just wonder how that discussion is proceeding in policy circles.
Okay. Richard had his hand up, and then we go. It's coming.
The microphone has found the hand. So, a question for Morgan. Absolutely fascinating stuff. I want to see this. I want to read the paper. I'd like to see more now, but we may not have time. But let me ask about another case study, as it were. Russia, late 19th century, catch-up, where Count Witte relied on foreign capital inflows. Was there any attempt to direct those capital inflows to particular sectors, any particular incentives? How does that, does it fit in your story, or is it something you really haven't looked at closely?
Okay, let's keep collecting. Yes, there. Okay. Two more in the middle, please. Yes, and okay. Lots of lots of hands coming up now. Good. Yes. Okay.
Can I ask Jeromin about his tantalizing very last sentence, where he talked about cooperative de-risking? Some of the de-risking is about China, and it's quite hard to cooperate with the source of risks. Is he really saying that there are some things that are shared risks, like pandemics and climate change, and that's when we cooperate, whereas there are others, like China catching up, and our ambition is to stop them catching up? Well, there's not a very interesting, it's a wrong word, not very possible conversation to have cooperatively if your ambition is to stop the Chinese catching up. So I'm asking you to separate, and do you agree with that suggestion of mine?
Mm-hmm. Okay, then there was Luis and Weder, and then we close the round.
My question is about what do we mean by nationalism? Do we have in mind, especially for Europe, do we have in mind the European Union, the European Commission, or do we have in mind individual countries? And going further on what Eric was asking about multilateralism, I think we have a crucial issue on which strategies we can have all the European countries cooperating together for EU policies. And probably things are very much different if we keep going on, for example, with industrial policies financed by national state aid without a common cooperative industrial policy framework. I think things would change crucially. So how can we get around with this? Thank you.
Okay. Okay, can we have a round of responses? And, sorry? Okay. Okay, Luis and Weder, and then we have responses.
Okay, so
yes,
very quickly. The integration of China globally was beneficial on this deflationary front, I think we all know. Now, if you get into even a coordinated, slow process of decoupling, it's going to be a series, even not thinking about a sudden shock, but it's going to be a series of gradual supply shocks of increasing production costs, even if we go for a slow reshoring and efficiency gains from that. So has the panel any view on the inflationary impact of this over the sort of the medium run? And if so, what would be the sort of the way in which central banks should react to that?
Okay, now here in the front, and then we close the round.
It's very brief. It's to Moritz. You said that the model does not take into account strategic materials, effects, and so on. And we know and have been identified some materials, very important in particular for EVs, but not only for EVs, for a lot of things, where China has a very, very strong position. Do you think that materially consideration of these shortage or the dominant position of China would materially change your results? Or
Okay, thank you. So, rich set of questions for all of you. Maybe with response, start with Morgan, since you did not get to give your conclusions. Maybe you can do so now.
Well, I won't bother with conclusions. I think I'll just answer the question directly. No, it's very much on the German line, like goes back to Gerschenkron, he analyzed this. But what you're looking at private investment in a railway, steel mills, but with very big state coordination. And then you've got no investment banks coordinating this. Again, they have very tight ties with the state. So it is, they say, like China, like very much, say, state and private industry working very closely together, yeah.
Okay. Chad, do you want to respond
Sure,
to the
very
questions
quickly.
addressed to you?
So maybe take two of Jeromin's questions on EV imports and how to operationalize some of these ideas. So, thought experiment, what if the European automobile industry and its supply chain disappears? I don't know the political economy well enough, but would that have serious negative effects on Germany, Europe's general willingness to remain open to trade? And I think that's fundamentally what we have to take into consideration. So, and it relates to your other question, could we operationalize Isabelle's, sort of metric into a new either trade defense instrument based on something like Article 21 or negotiate something with China cooperatively? Yeah, I mean, from an economic perspective, you go back, there's this wonderful paper by Bob Steger and Kyle Bagwell in 1990, the AER, and was basically stealing from the IO repeated game collusion literature, right? So there, Rodenberg and Saloner, you've got firms colluding over time. The penalty is sort of retaliation. A trade framework, tariffs are sort of cooperation. Low tariffs are cooperation between government, but governments get hit with shocks, which sometimes need to cause them to raise their tariffs. And so we think of the existing exceptions that we have in the WTO system, whether it's the anti-subsidy thing that the Europeans are using right now or anti-dumping. None of these make economic efficiency sense at all. But they're all sort of thought as these are ways that we keep broader cooperation going. So would this be one way to keep broader cooperation going? Yeah. I think how to do that with China, I think if China saw this as being aimed at them, they would say, well, what are you going to give me for it, right? And then we have to open up into negotiations, and then maybe you have to offer them something else somewhere else in a multilateral sense. If we were in ever politically that environment to start talking with each other again, I think it would be entirely possible.
Isabelle, you want to?
So just to come back on, I think a lot of questions are about like the overall cost and path of de-risking or decoupling. Moritz was very clear about the fact that the scenario they are doing is very extreme. I don't think anybody is really talking about completely decoupling from China. And what we see as well from more disaggregated analysis is that actually the areas of trade networks whereby we think there is actually a very high risk, a very strong degree of concentration are kind of localized. So we are not talking about like this extreme scenario. We are talking about things that are much more localized. And just wanted to react on Linda's point. I strongly agree. I mean, there are trade-offs. There are trade-offs between efficiency gains and resilience gains, and there are also trade-offs that can be related to economies of scale in general, and also like economies on, I mean, CO2 and pollution in general. So this is where you really want to have this kind of narrow analysis that takes together the gains and benefits. And what you're saying about mining is very true about chemistry in general. Chemistry, we tend to think is a production that involves a lot of economies of scale and also a lot of economies of CO2. So you don't want to like reshore everything, and you want to take into account the benefits and the cost of this type of policies.
Great. This is on? No. How did you switch it on?
It's on.
Oh, it's on. Great. Yeah, fantastic questions. I'm going to make 2 points, and they connect directly to what Isabelle just said. Like this, I think in terms of the strategy overall, Chad mentioned it as well. Of course, we talk about de-risking now. It's a great word. Now, who could be opposed to that? Like, who doesn't like to reduce risk? It's genius. And decoupling actually refers to the real choices that are in there. And I'm not 100% sure that the de-risking euphemism is actually doing us a favor, because there are real choices, and we throw sand in the wheels. And I don't think the small yard high fence idea is so easy. If you look at EVs, for example, a lot of people in the security community say, well, these are like basically spy machines on wheels with lots of sensors and cameras that communicate directly with their company headquarters in China. Do you want millions of those in your streets? Wind turbines sound innocent, but they're all coordinated by satellites. They're all made in China. They can all be switched off at some point if you don't take all these precautions, which again are costly. So I don't think that small yard high fence is so easy. So I think this de-risking, maybe, like we can all agree, yeah, we should be like into it. This is what Weder also said, like, yeah, these few, like 5 strategic materials the German car makers need, like, let's get them from somewhere else and we're done. I don't think it's so easy. And I think Linda's point goes to exactly, there's these environmental costs, and they will add to the cost. Like, we probably want to do this in a cleaner way in Europe if we have to do it in Europe, so it's going to be more costly. But overall, and this is the second point, is I think in terms of the strategy, there is this idea that, I mean, all of us kind of, I think, grew up with, which is like, you know, there's an opportunity, if you trade more, the opportunity cost of going to war goes up, so de-risking, decoupling from China means we also lose the leverage over China. On the other hand, I think the recent Russian experience taught us something else, which is the less you trade, the lower your opportunity cost to come to the defense of someone else. Because that was the political economy in Europe last year, was very much like, because we have so much trade with Europe, we can't help Ukraine because it's too costly for us. And since we're interacting most of the time with autocracies, they can swallow the 5% GDP hit. We have a much bigger problem. So from that point, I'm not 100% sure if our logic, like de-risking, decoupling, actually increases the risk of war because there's less to lose, works out. I think in a dynamic sense, us being credible, actually we would defend Taiwan, might make the attack less likely, etc. So I think we need to reconfigure. We're all in this more trade equals less war risk mold, and I don't think it's necessarily the right way to think about trade with autocracies.
Okay, so maybe 2 or 3 points. So in response, David Vine's question, I think you may have understood my question from the way in which Chad answered it, right? So what I meant was not cooperating with China in on global public goods in areas where cooperation is clearly beneficial, but in defining the rules of confrontation with respect to trade, right? So the problem with China is then whenever we do the slightest thing, start a completely WTO compliant investigation on EVs, they blow up in some way. So it kind of seems obvious to say to them, look, guys, we know that you're trying to go for the first best here, which is that we don't do anything about you. We split up with the US, and just continue trading with you as business as usual, and watch you annihilate our EV industry. But that's not in the cards. So could we maybe agree on a modus operandi to reorient our trade relations while keeping 95% of the welfare benefits, right? So that is sort of the naive idea. Maybe one reaction to what Moritz just said. I mean, you now defined economic security in a way that none of these papers looked at, right? Which has to do with national security, pure and simple, about giving the Chinese essentially stealing data and finding out how to attack us by having certain goods or facilities physically in Europe, or by having teenagers on TikTok or something like that. So in principle, I'm not asking you to do this, but this would fit into your last box. I mean, Isabelle, don't look the other way. Where your non-economic risks thing. So you could write a section about that. I don't think you should do that, but you probably need a caveat, right? What we are talking about here, and that's where I think the small fence paradigm, or small yard paradigm really does work, is on trade dependency, right? And that's completely in the spirit of your first Russia paper, which is, guys, it's probably not that bad in most cases because there is substitution, right? And that's a very important message to convey, because the policy is driven by a completely naive idea of what dependencies really are, right? Doesn't mean that we have to be more sanguine on other areas where they just start spying on us. So we might well be more sanguine in one area and less sanguine as in the other area. And then my final point is, maybe Maureen, can you try and answer my question, which is are there any general lessons on when this stuff works? And particularly also, do you see episodes that are specifically driven by these security concerns as opposed to developmental catch-up, rents, and so forth? Do you see this in the 19th century, and how did those play out?
Oh, sure. Okay, probably the biggest, you need to remember, before the 20th century, economies are very, very simple. Okay, so it's very, very hard to hurt them. And so where you start to see basically what we would think of as economic warfare is in the late 19th century in the chemical industry. That what happens is, the Germans come up with sophisticated, organic chemicals, and then they use this to quite deliberately destroy the industries in Britain and France. That what you have is they go along, they patent individual colors in these places. They don't have to manufacture them there. So the British and French industries basically completely die, and it's quite deliberate on the part of the Germans. So when you have then the First World War starts, the Brits find themselves in a situation they don't have dye for uniforms. That is the Germans who go and produce this, so they have to buy it through the Netherlands, a neutral place. So that is one of the sort of strongest examples. They also know all their acetone for explosives, that's coming from Germany, all the dynamos for electric motors and things for all of these things. So they then have to come up with substitutes. They develop their own sort of chemical industry in the interwar period. It's pretty crap. It's just a sort of satellite of IG Farben. But so that would be, I think, historically the closest example. Again, it's a period of complete laissez-faire by the British. The Germans can do what they want, sort of comparative advantage. And then it comes back and it bites them in the ass. And it really comes back to Adam Smith, this trade-off between opulence and security. And for Smith, the bottom line is, okay, that we love opulence, but national security, as Moritz saying, that really is what it's all about. Not all about. Well, no, when it comes to these sort of situations where you have all these hostile foreigners out to get you, as you guys assure us there really are, yeah.
All right. Thank you very much to all of you. I was very happy to hear, Eric, that these are the set of the most exciting papers that you have encountered in recent time. It's obvious that the issues that we are talking about are extremely exciting, and it is, in a way, I'm always a bit hesitant, whether it's good news or bad news. The fact that Isabelle and Moritz find the dependency effects are not as large as you thought. But then there seem to be still always a lot of question marks about whether they couldn't be much, much bigger than we think. To be continued, I think, is the answer.